The forest at night is not the same place you hike through at noon. The trees you leaned against for a photo become towering black walls, and the silence between cricket calls fills with a pressure that feels like held breath. Most people never experience that version of the woods, but the men and women who work the night. Shift and forestry know it intimately. They spend 10-12 hours alone under canopy, so thick it swallows headlights, and they learn to distinguish the normal sounds of a settling forest from something else entirely. Tonight, 3 of those workers are going to share what happened when the line between tree and creature blurred, when the forest proved that it wasn't just alive but was paying attention. Dale ran a feller buncher on a midnight clearing operation and watched a stand of pines rearrange itself every time his strobe light cut out. Naomi led a survey crew through old-growth timber and discovered that the grid stakes they'd pounded into the earth were being moved by something that left no footprints. And Leonard, a night watchman at a remote lumber mill, realized the logs in the yard were assembling themselves into a shape that was learning how to stand. These are not folk tales. These are their own words, and once you hear them, you'll never walk through a dark stand of timber without wondering if the trees behind you just shifted a little closer. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and let the forest close in. I've run heavy machinery in the woods for 23 years, and I've seen things that would make most folks sell their boots. Nothing prepared me for the night shift on the Kettle Creek tract. A 60-acre cut of second-growth pine that the company wanted cleared by the end of the month. They put me on a feller buncher with a rotating cab and a strobe warning light that pulsed amber every 2 seconds, because it was cheaper to run one man at night than to pay for traffic control during the day. The first week was uneventful endless cycles of grab, cut, pile, the hydraulic hiss and the thud of trunks hitting the slash mat, all under a bowl of stars that never quite pierced the canopy. But on the 11th night, around 2 a.m., I noticed a pine about 30 yards off the cut line that I didn't remember being there. It was a big lobbly, straight and thick, and I knew my grid because I'd mapped it myself the evening before. I stared at it through the cab window, and the strobe flashed. For a split second, the tree was gone, then the light came back, and it stood exactly where it had been. Only now there were 2 of them. I killed the saw and sat there with the engine idling, my heart doing a slow, heavy thump. And I watched those 2 trees under the strobe's rhythm flash. They were 8 feet apart. Flash. They were 4 feet apart. Flash. They were touching bark pressed together like lovers. And I swear on my mother's grave I heard a sound like wood groaning under immense pressure, except it wasn't wood. It was a note, a low, resonant hum that vibrated up through the tracks of my machine and into my teeth. I radioed the night foreman, a guy named Chuck. But all I got back was static that sounded almost like whispering, layered and sibilant, and I realized the static was matching the rhythm of the strobe. I reversed the buncher, intending to get distance, and the moment the tracks moved, every pine within my headlight range shifted. I don't mean swayed in the wind. There was no wind. I mean the entire stand relocated, sliding sideways across the duff like chess pieces. And the clearing I'd made an hour earlier was suddenly full of trees again. A solid wall of bark and needle where open ground had been. The hum grew louder, and now I could hear individual notes in it, discordant chord that made my fillings ache. And the strobe light started flickering erratically, not dying, but stuttering in a pattern that felt deliberate. A code. I looked down at the control panel, and all the gauges were swinging wildly, and the cab began to creak as if something was pressing against the roof. I forced myself to look up, and through the mesh guard. Directly above the skylight, I saw a cluster of branches that had not been there a second before thick. Gnarled limbs that were lowering themselves toward the glass, their tips curling inward like fingers. I punched the throttle and drove blind, plowing through saplings and slash. The whole forest screaming around me with that cord now a deafening roar, and I burst out onto the logging road with the buncher trailing vines and torn bark. I didn't stop until I reached the landing, where Chuck found me white-faced and shaking, and he told me I'd only been out of radio contact for 4 minutes. 4 minutes. I'd lost 2 hours of cleared work, and the cut line was back to virgin timber, as if the night had simply undone everything. The company blamed equipment malfunction and moved me to day shift, but I went back once, on my own, at dusk. The pines were standing still then, but I found something at the edge of the tract, a series of deep, conical holes, spaced evenly like a grid, each one filled with a dark, sticky fluid that smelled like sap and copper. At the bottom of one hole was a boot, my boot. The left one I'd lost that night, its leather half dissolved, the steel toe bent outward as if something had tried to digest it. No. I left Forestry 6 months later, and I still dream of that hum, that chord. And the way the trees moved, not like plants, but like a slow, patient muscle. A throat swallowing the clearing I had carved out of its flesh. They knew I was there long before I saw them, and they let me go only because I was too tough and metallic to digest. But the next man might be softer, and the forest is still hungry. My crew and I were contracted to grid and tag 100 acres of old-growth Douglas fir in the Cascades, pre-harvest survey that required us to live on site for 2 weeks. There were 4 of us, me, a graduate student named Evan, and 2 experienced techs, Marcus and Sylvie. We worked 12-hour shifts, pounding numbered aluminum stakes into the duff at precise GPS intervals and recording the diameter and health of every tree within each plot. The forest was cathedral quiet, the kind of ancient stillness that makes you lower your voice instinctively, and from the first day I had the feeling we were being watched not by animals, but by the trees themselves, which is a stupid thing to say, unless you've stood in a grove of 400-year-old firs and felt the weight of their attention. The trouble started with the stakes. On the 3rd morning, we hiked out to Plot 17 and found the stake missing, not pulled. Not knocked over, but simply gone. The hole it had occupied filled with undisturbed pine needles, as if no metal had ever pierced the soil. I assumed an animal had dug it up, but there were no claw marks, no displaced earth. And when we rehammered the stake and marked it with flagging tape, the tape was gone by evening. The stake once again vanished. This happened 4 more times across different plots, always at night, always with no sign of disturbance. On the 6th night, I decided to stay up and watch. I sat on a log at the edge of camp with a thermos of coffee and a night vision binocular, and for hours nothing happened except the slow wheel of stars. Around 1 a.m. I heard a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the direction of Plot 22, a tapping, metallic and resonant like a hammer striking an aluminum stake. I woke Marcus and we moved quietly through the dark with our headlamps off, and when we reached the plot, I saw something that drained the warmth from my blood. The stake was hovering. It floated 18 inches above the duff, spinning slowly, and around it the air was thick with a distortion I can only describe as heat shimmer, though the night was cold. Beneath the stake, the earth was opening, a circular fissure that pulsed like a throat swallowing, and from the fissure rose a pale, root-like appendage that coiled around the stake, and drew it down into the soil with a wet sucking sound. Marcus gasped, and the distortion in the air snapped toward us, and suddenly the trees around us, massive, immovable firs that had stood for centuries, bent. Not in the wind. There was no wind. They arched their trunks toward us, closing the gap with a groan of stressed cellulose, and the tapping sound multiplied. A cascade of metal impacts coming from every plot across the hillside. I grabbed Marcus and ran, and behind us I heard the crash of timber, not falling but lunging. Root balls tearing free of the earth in explosions of soil as the ancient trees uprooted themselves and took a step. One step, that's all they needed, a single. Ground-shaking lurch that brought the nearest fir within arm's reach of my back, its bark splitting open to reveal a wet, pink interior that stank of iron and chlorophyll. I felt something brush my spine, a cold tendril, and then I was through the camp and into the truck. And we were bouncing down the logging road with the headlights catching glimpses of the forest in motion, trunks swaying, branches flailing, the whole mountainside alive and furious. Evan and Sylvie were already in the truck, eyes wide. They'd heard the tapping too, had seen the stakes they'd hammered that afternoon rise out of the ground and launch themselves horizontally into the dark. We drove until we hit a paved road, and I called the project manager from a gas station payphone, my voice shaking so hard I could barely speak. He was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "You're the third crew that's happened to. We'll mail your checks." He hung up, and no one from the company ever contacted us again. I researched the area later and found that the tract was part of a larger parcel that had never been successfully logged despite a century of attempts. Equipment broke down, roads washed out, crews quit. The indigenous name for the valley translated roughly to the place where the trees. Remember, I think the trees weren't just remembering. They were waiting, and the stakes we hammered into their flesh were an insult they refused to tolerate. To this day, I cannot walk through a forest without feeling that deep, silent attention, and every time a branch taps against a window, I check my feet to make sure the ground isn't opening beneath me. The Sawtooth Timber Mill was a sprawling compound of corrugated sheds, conveyor belts, and log decks tucked into a bend of the Satsop River. And for 7 years, I was the night watchman. The only soul on the property between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., my job was to walk a loop every hour, clocking in at key stations and to listen for the sound of equipment failure or trespassers. The trespassers I found were usually teenagers drinking beer, nothing a flashlight and a gruff voice couldn't handle. But the logs themselves were the ones that taught me fear. It began with the sorting. Each morning the day crew would stack the incoming timber by grade and species peelers here, saw logs there, pulpwood in the big pile by the chipper, and every night I'd walk past those stacks and see them perfectly orderly. Then one October, I started noticing that the stacks were different when I came back around on my next loop. Not drastically. A log would have rolled off a pile and come to rest a few feet away, or a stack that had been 4 high would be 5 high, the top log clearly not placed by any crane. I figured the ground was settling, or maybe the night shift cleanup guy was messing with me. But one night I found a stack of 12-foot peelers arranged in a perfect circle, their ends pointing outward like spokes. And in the center of the circle, the gravel had been swept clean, and a single cedar bow laid across it, still green and fragrant. That was no prank. I started paying closer attention, and I realized that whenever I walked past the log decks, I could hear a sound beneath the window, creaking murmur, like voices heard through a thick wall. The sound came from the logs themselves, the fibers of the wood vibrating with a tension that shouldn't have been there. I put my hand on a peeled fir and felt it warm, almost feverish, and a drop of clear, sticky resin oozed out and ran down my wrist, burning like acid. I jumped back, and the entire pile groaned in unison, a collective exhale, and then I saw the shape. At the far end of the yard, where the oldest, most twisted logs were storage ejects that were too knotty or crooked to milth. The logs were moving, not rolling, lifting. They were rising off the deck, floating a few inches above the supports. And they were assembling themselves into a form. It was crude at first, a pyramid of timber that swayed as if drunk. But with each passing second, the arrangement grew more deliberate, more anatomical. A central trunk of laminated cedar, branches of hemlock, joined end to end like vertebrae. Ahead, the stump of a giant old-growth fir, its root mass twisting into something that resembled a face, with hollow knots for eyes and a split in the bark that opened and closed with a wet, sticky sound. The thing stood on 2 pillars of Douglas fir, and it was icily 30 feet tall, and it turned its knot eyes toward me. I dropped my flashlight and ran for the office, and behind me, I heard the crash of logs tumbling as the thing took a step. The ground shook. I reached the office, slammed the door, and called my supervisor on the night line, screaming that the yard was alive, that the logs were walking. He thought I'd had a stroke and told me to sit tight. He'd send someone. I sat there with my back against the desk, listening to the rhythmic boom of those footfalls circling the office, and then the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap on the metal siding, like a branch in the wind. But it was too deliberate, too rhythmic, and it was spelling something out in Morse code that I didn't know, but could almost understand something about joining, about being one with the forest, about my bones being fine-grained and strong. The window shattered inward, and a limb of woven willow flexible, alive, slithered through and wrapped around my ankle. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and beat at it until the tendril released, leaving a circle of blistered skin that wept sap instead of blood. I crawled into the bathroom and wedged myself against the toilet as the building creaked and groaned under an assault of timber. The whole mill yard awake and hungry. Dawn came like a rescue, the sun spilling over the hills and stilling the logs in their tracks. And when the day crew arrived, they found me half-conscious. The yard a wreck of scattered timber, the stacks collapsed, and in the middle of the main deck, a towering effigy of interlocked logs shaped like a man with a hollow chest. The company bulldozed the effigy and fired me for drinking on the job. They found a bottle in the office that wasn't mine. But I had no defense except the truth, and the truth sounded insane. Moved away, took a job as a night janitor at a school. But I never forgot the way that Root-Face looked at me. It wasn't angry, it was curious, like a child presented with a new toy. And I knew it had let me go only because it wanted to play longer. Sometimes on quiet nights I'll hear a tap, tap, tap on my window frame. When I look out I'll see a single fresh green leaf lying on the sill, even in winter, even though there are no trees on my street. The mill yard is a parking lot now, but I know the logs are still there, buried under asphalt, dreaming of the next night when they can rise and finish the game we started. The forest doesn't need us to be afraid. It simply waits. And sometimes, on a night shift, when the saws are off and the headlights are dim, it shows a glimpse of what it's been doing while we weren't looking. Dale, Naomi, and Leonard all walked back into the daylight. But they carried the woods with them in the hum they still hear, in the tap at the window, in the feeling that the trees are never quite as still as they pretend to be, If these stories rooted themselves in your mind, please hit that like button and subscribe. I'll keep bringing you true human-voiced horror that reminds you nature is not a backdrop but a participant. Drop a comment. Have you ever worked a night shift in the middle of nowhere and felt the forest watching? I read every story, and the most chilling ones will be featured in a future video. Until next time, be careful where you drive your stakes. Keep an eye on your log piles. And if you hear tapping in the dark, don't tap back. Sleep tight.